Welcome to the Just Third Way podcast, where we ask the question, would you rather own or be owned? Brought to you by the Center for Economic and Social Justice at cesj.org.
Hello, this is your host, Dave Hamill. Welcome back to the Just Third Way podcast. And we have a special guest today, Joyce Hart. Hello, Joyce.
Hi, Dave. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here talking to your audience.
Well, it's great to have you here with us. And you're the kind of person that will probably add to our audience. If people ever search out your work, they might see that you are on a podcast, and it will help us.
Great.
I don't know if everyone knows to associate your name with your excellent work, but I believe the one that comes to mind for most people is the Sisters of Selma, because you are a documentary filmmaker. Is that correct?
That is correct. And Sisters of Selma is one of the films that I've made that have had nationwide, and probably outside of the United States as well, nationwide distribution.
Well, it was a great documentary film. I watched it, and it was a story that I wasn't previously familiar with, and what a magnificent story it was. You know, at the time, I wasn't born, or I was, let's see, what was that, 63?
It was 65, actually,
65,
March of
okay.
65.
See, I was born in 66, but I was raised in the South, so I knew about the culture and the conflicts. And I think going back and watching that film, I might say that those particular nuns who went down there probably kicked off the whole, I guess you could say white morality support to the movement. Would you say that at least they were a big part of it?
Yes, I think so. I think they really brought to the movement. Well, let me very briefly say what the film was about for those who haven't seen Sisters of Selma.
Okay.
It's, in a broader sense, about the Catholic involvement in civil rights in the American South. And it was specifically about the nuns who marched with Dr. Martin Luther King to protest against the attacks on people in the South demanding voting rights.
Right.
And I didn't grow up in the United States, so the whole civil rights story was new to me. We in India, where I grew up, knew vaguely about Dr. Martin Luther King because of his interest in Gandhi. But we really didn't know much about American civil rights. So for me, it was educational, as much about American civil rights and the movements in the 60s as about the Catholic Church. And so it was very interesting to me to find out that in the Midwest, the Catholic Church had already begun integrating its schools.
And those particular nuns were in St. Louis, right?
That's right. The first group
so they were
that
starting
went down,
to integrate there.
They already had.
Okay,
many of them worked in schools. As you know, nuns were the backbone of the Catholic efforts in healthcare and education.
Okay.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. You were raised Baptist, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. So when I say, as you know, I kind of assume that many people in the Center for Economic and Social Justice, CESJ, are Catholic. And so I forget that you are not.
Right.
Right. But I realize that the Catholic Church, because of the 1962 encyclicals that came out of Vatican II, had developed this special interest in the poor. And the poor just happened to be minorities and others who didn't have rights.
Yeah,
in this
primarily,
country.
right.
Right. And so, because of the integration, because they were working in areas which were underserved, the nuns had this special interest in rights, in civil rights and voting rights. And that's why, as soon as Dr. Martin Luther King sent out his plea to people in the North, people of all faiths in the North, to come and protest along with him, they found a natural affinity to his cause. And
Right.
yeah, and so it was very interesting to me. And to answer your question about them awakening the white, what did you call it? Not the white liberal,
Morality, really. It
morality.
was, yeah, not really a political thing, but just,
Mm-hmm.
whites in general recognizing that there was no way that you could, say you have a moral country when a group
Mm-hmm.
of people are being denied, well, access to the ballot, for example, and among, obviously the
Right.
abuses.
Right. I'm not sure I would say that, because when I was talking to people about, these issues in the South, we were in Selma several times interviewing people. I'm not sure that the movement really awakened the sense of morality in the South. Most of the white people who were supporting the Martin Luther King and
Came from
his
up north, yeah.
were from the North and from the Midwest, from California, from New York, exactly. And people in the South felt invaded,
Right,
and and that again is something I understood. When I
right,
worked on this documentary, I began to understand that confrontation doesn't always produce the results that you want.
right.
And so I think there was a backlash, like there was a backlash after emancipation.
Right.
Most of the worst oppression of black people in the South happened after emancipation, right?
Right, right. That's true.
Yeah. So these are,
And I am familiar with what you're talking about because having grown up in the South, there were so many people who thought that the big issue was the more or less federal intervention in local governance and local activities. So I'm not necessarily in any defense of that position, but that was, one of the prevailing arguments.
right.
And then at some point, you must have started looking at other proposals that had to do with human rights, and at some point you ran across Kelso's ideas. Is that right?
Yes, actually, it was very interesting how I came across Kelso's ideas. This was a long time after Sisters of Selma. I use a post house here in California. I'm in the Los Angeles area, and I use a post-production house which was trying to become a employee-owned
Oh, wow.
studio. Right. I was surprised at that point to find out that there are several employee-owned studios. Hollywood is one of the few places which has, which is very familiar with employee ownership.
Oh, that's great.
So, yes, I was really pleasantly surprised. But this particular company failed to become an employee-owned company, because their lawyers couldn't really figure it out. And later on, when I talked to Corey Rosen of the National NCEO, the National
Center for Employee Ownership.
Employee Ownership, correct.
Right.
When I talked to him, he said, "Oh, they should have contacted us," but nobody knew to contact the NCEO. They just hadn't done their homework. Anyway, that got me interested in employee ownership efforts in this country, and that took me to Louis Kelso. But the reason I really stayed with Louis Kelso, it was because my background, and I think this is true of most of us, that our backgrounds really dictate our politics, our development as individuals. When I was growing up in the 60s, I'm quite a bit older than you, so the 60s are part of my childhood in India.
I wouldn't have guessed it.
Well, we look after ourselves in the movie industry. We're lugging heavy equipment around all the time.
Oh, that's right.
So, right. So To go back to growing up in India, this was at the tail end of the aftermath of independence, when the country was divided into three, and what used to be uh, East Pakistan is now Bangladesh, but at that time it was still East Pakistan, and people were coming from there into my part of India. They were refugees.
Okay.
And so have a very clear memory, even though I was a toddler at that time. I have very clear memories of people sleeping on the pavement, something that you don't see much anymore.
Right.
Um, and there were whole families who were starving. They were uprooted, and not necessarily because they were oppressed in their home state, but because it was a new government, there were religious differences, and they were afraid. So I understood what displacement could do to people. So when I read about Kelso, I immediately saw what Kelso's early experience of displacement in the American Depression, the Great Depression, meant to him.
Right.
And I ended up becoming a contrarian because of that experience. I saw what charity could do to people, because in a situation like that, if you offer someone some kind of sustenance for the time being, and then you try to help him stand on his own 2 feet, it's one thing. But if you then continue the charity, it demoralizes people. They really lose confidence in their ability to help themselves.
Right.
And Kelso saw this. And so immediately it kind of struck a chord with me.
I see.
And
Yeah.
and so I decided to just follow. And it's kind of interesting because people like John Menke, who was an ESOP lawyer and is still practicing in Oakland, when I talked to him, he said the same thing, that he had lived through the Depression. He had early memories of the Depression, and so he could see what Kelso was trying to do.
I think that is a very interesting point because, we had, as I look at the history of the movement, we had a sort of peak in an interest in the, late 70s, early 80s maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And then it seemed like other solutions prevailed more. Although the employee ownership, percentage of corporations has continued to increase.
Yes.
And that is a testament to how good the concept of widespread ownership is.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the actual political discussion has moved away from Kelso's ideas so that not as many people know about it. And it may be because we have fewer people who lived through the Depression now.
Exactly. That's what I would say. If you've lived through something, it's real to you. I mean, Norm Kurland, who is the head of the Center for Economic and Social Justice, the CESJ, he had a similar experience,
Right.
going through the war, of seeing civil rights and seeing the efforts in the South. And that's what made him react to Kelso's ideas like I did. I mean,
Right.
we're different generations, but we came across Kelso's ideas and we thought, hey, here's the solution.
And that is a good piece of information to digest and think about as we formulate our strategy for advancing the movement. Because I think I had mentioned to you, one of my purposes in interviewing people is to find out why some see these ideas and consider them to be important and worth promoting, and others just dismiss it. Even after learning about it, extensively, they'll say, well, either it's not going to happen or, it's just, pie in the sky, or, well, people won't participate because they're stupid or whatever. And yet other people, it's like, wait, this is the way to go. Why are we not doing this? Let's get this, happening here, So it may be that you have to see bad times and injustices before you realize how important it is.
I agree with you entirely. And since you bring this up, I probably should mention that the reason why I am asking myself the same questions and the reason why I'm paying such great attention to something that interests you too, and that is why some people react positively and others don't, what it is that people react to in Kelso's ideas or in capital homesteading is the reason why I'm so concerned is that I'm making this film about Louis Kelso, and it's really about ownership, which
Right.
is, I do sincerely believe that's what Louis Kelso would have liked me to do, to make a film about ownership and not about him.
Right.
Uh, it's it's that attitude to ownership because as many people have said, and films have been made by the ESOP Association and about other people promoting ESOPs, that employee ownership is about owning the risks as well as owning the rewards.
That's true. Unfortunately, that is one of the drawbacks. But on the flip side of that coin, the laws in our country are favorable to large numbers of people owning a business in terms of the bankruptcies of a corporation with many shareholders do not mar the ability of those people to do other things, for the next 7 years or whatever it is. If you are an individual owner of a corporation and it goes bankrupt, it can certainly hurt your ability to do the same kind of business for, really more like 10 years after that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
But that
but
is a good point.
well, thank you, because listening to you, I realize that these are some of the issues that you think about from a whole different perspective than mine. And it's really interesting for me to hear, being a businessman yourself, what kinds of issues come to mind when you think about risks.
Right.
But
Well,
yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but it is also, again, the experience of adversity, just as Kelso and the lawyer that you mentioned had lived through the Depression and also some of your experiences. And I think my experience in having some business success and then having some business failure and living the typical American, consumer lifestyle where I have, a house and a mortgage and cars that are, requiring a payment, and then the business goes bad, and so next thing you know, I'm working two jobs and 70, 80, 90 hours a week sometimes, trying to make sure that my family can maintain their lifestyle, realizing that it's the boom and bust of the money system that is the problem. And the reason why my business well, obviously, I mean, there was some poor management too. Can't dismiss that, but I do think that probably 70% at least of businesses that fail during these bust cycles would have been okay. I mean, if you look at 2008 most recently, you
Mm-hmm.
could just go in any middle class neighborhood and probably every other house, people living there could tell you how they barely made it through 2008, or they had a business that went down and they had to get a job flipping burgers or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that the boom and the bust cycle is a significant problem in small business ownership. And that's what brought me to this solution. So yeah, that's a little bit of research that we've done for each other. And you could
Right.
mention in your
Right.
film that.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
speaking of film, we
absolutely.
need to talk about that.
Right, absolutely. And I think this is part of what the film really is about. It's about our different experiences because in every generation, I see, in fact, in all of my films, I've seen that over time there are communities which are insulated from each other. For instance, I grew up in a community where everybody ended up in college. I mean, it was unheard of. If one of us didn't go into college, there was something wrong with us.
Wow.
And not
That's good.
only did the children all go, it's not, because it
Okay.
doesn't equip you for anything else. First of all, you lose your empathy for anybody who works with anything outside. And when I say go to college, I mean people who are not business people, people who are employees, basically. They're tech employees. All of these tech employees you see from India in the United States, they are really from the kind of background that I'm talking about.
I see.
Right.
Yeah, there's a certain
And
culture there where it is all about getting a specialized education and
correct.
having a good job, and
Exactly.
not as much of an entrepreneurial
Right.
attitude.
Right. But there is also the entrepreneurial community in India. For instance, the ones that run the motels. I don't know if
Right.
you've traveled in the South, but
Well, the
whenever my
joke is that
husband and I,
every hotel is owned by the Patel family.
there you go.
Right.
Right. And from the same country, you know.
Right. Right.
And we don't speak to each other, which is why in India we have the same problem you have here. The Republicans and the Democrats don't want to talk to each other. Over there, the business community and the intellectual community, they have no way of communicating with each other because of this past.
Wow, I didn't realize that. I knew
Yeah.
that they had a very, structured, what I guess it's called a caste system in India, where certain people in certain classes, more or less, don't associate with others. But I didn't realize that it translated into that particular separation.
Well, when you have a system that's been around for several thousand years, it's kind of hard to get rid of it
Right, right,
overnight. Right. So these are the modern repercussions of something that goes way back.
right.
And I think, again, as we were saying earlier, it's got to do with our experiences and our culture and what we've been brought up to expect out of life.
Right, right.
Right.
So you are in the process of making a documentary about ownership and how Kelso started the movement. And,
Right.
okay, I want to make sure that you do get to talk about specifically what your project is and how people in CESJ can help you with your project.
Oh, thank you. I would love to do that.
Okay.
Louis Kelso was a San Francisco lawyer who had grown up in the Depression in Colorado, and he wondered why, on the one hand, he saw all of the luxuries that American economy had produced in the 1920s available. You know, there were these wonderful railroad carriages for passengers going by empty. But then people were riding in boxcars. The freight cars had people riding in them free of charge, whereas
That is so,
passenger trains were going empty.
yeah, that is so true. I bet that was a very weird situation.
Right. But then 1,000 Americans must have seen that and not thought about it. But here is a 16-year-old Kelso who sees that and says, what's wrong with this picture?
Yeah.
And so that gets him started. He wants to go to the University of Colorado, the economics department. He doesn't get in. And so he ends up studying law,
Okay.
becomes a lawyer. He enlists right after Pearl Harbor, and then he's in Panama for the rest of the war. Then he
Okay.
comes back, starts practicing in San Francisco, and he is a very good tax lawyer. So because of his reputation, he gets a call from a client of the firm he works for, asking if there's any way this man, this owner who wants to retire, can pass his business along to the employees. And Kelso uses the existing tax laws to devise a way that the employees can borrow money against the projected income
Right.
and pay for the company, which then will eventually become theirs, and they will own shares of that company, of that. It was a publishing house, actually. It was called Peninsula Newspapers. That was
Oh,
the
okay.
company. So this was the first Kelso plan where the whole concept of employee ownership started. And then while, this thing was going through, other people got interested. So he devised a trust for a consumer cooperative. The farmers in the Central Valley in California were being gouged by the oil companies for their fertilizer. So they got together, and here's the entrepreneurial spirit that always fascinates me because I grew up as an intellectual. I mean,
Right.
I never knew people who were entrepreneurial. So here's this group of people, they say, we can make the fertilizer at half the price. Why should we be paying the oil companies? So
Right. They just needed to pool their resources probably to have the manufacturing facility.
Absolutely, which they did. And Kelso devised this trust, which he called the Consumer Ownership Trust, CSOP, Consumer Stock Ownership Trust.
Oh, okay.
And so then they operated for a while very successfully. Then the oil companies got behind them because this was still not legal, By law, it was not allowed. So he had to kind of work around what they called loopholes. Loopholes. And loopholes still have a bad name. And so they worked around these tax loopholes and they got this thing going. Then the oil companies came after them with their whole teams of lawyers and got this shut down. But during the time that they could operate, they had figured out a way to do this. And so they used other laws to continue their business. But then this is happening in the 50s. Throughout the 60s, this continues, and then Canada gets wind of it, and there are some proposals in Canada. More in the United States, there are several companies in Colorado which start what they call the Kelso plans. Kelso, meanwhile, he thinks of this as a second income plan for most employees, not just employees who are trying to purchase from their owner, but employees who would like to have some income coming from capital ownership as well as from their wages. And so he starts devising these plans which allow employees to borrow money on future earnings of their company.
Right.
And this eventually gets the attention. Norm Kurland comes into the picture first, actually. Our mutual friend Norm Kurland, who was at that time working for, I think, the Campaign Against Poverty. First, he was working for the government, but when he found out about this, he was working for the Campaign Against Poverty.
That's right.
The Poor People's Campaign Against Poverty. I think that's what it was called. And he met with Kelso, and he had this aha moment where he thought, gee, this is the answer.
Right.
And they established a Washington, D.C. office and eventually met with Senator Russell Long, Senator Louis Long. And Senator Long, I love this particular line he uses. Senator Long is from the South, so he really has a very pithy way of putting things. So he says, I don't care who's right, but I know what's right when I see it.
That's right.
He realized that this thing was what was needed to get people. At that point, especially at that point in American history, people were worried about full employment because without employment, people were just not able to make ends meet. Like you described, the typical American lifestyle where you have payments to make.
Right.
In India, that generation had savings. They didn't understand credit that much. But here, consumer credit was already in force and very popular. And so people had payments to make. Without jobs, they couldn't make their payments.
Right.
And so full employment was a very major concern in those days. And obviously Senator Long saw that this was a way to get people out of this cycle of, job loss and inability to make payments and, multiple jobs.
Right.
So he says, I know this is what's right. And the argument against that was, well, you're using tax loopholes.
Right.
And Russell Long's answer to that was, well, if you need some sugar to get the horse into the barn, I'm not going to argue against it.
Right. That's true.
So, yeah. And
Many successful people use tax loopholes. We might as well set it up so that many workers, take advantage of tax loopholes.
Yeah. And he actually passed 17 laws in his time as chairperson of the Joint Finance Committee, the Senate Finance Committee. He chaired a few of the joint hearings as well, but he was the head of the Senate Finance Committee, and during his tenure, there were 17 laws passed to make this legal.
Wow.
And I just found out that the Small Business Committee had passed 2 more laws, which made it easier for small businesses to operate their employee ownership trusts. And this was this particular Congress that passed it,
wow.
Just last week. Right.
Oh, that's good.
So even though we don't talk about it much, I think this idea, as you said, has a lot of different people of different backgrounds with the same experience rooting for it.
That's good. So do you think we will see much progress on the larger proposal that Kelso had, which he called industrial homesteading, and that we now call capital homesteading?
I don't know. I honestly don't. There needs to be a trigger. I think in Kelso's time, the trigger was the end of the prosperity produced by World War II and the anxiety about the Vietnam War.
Right.
I think these 2 things pushed people into looking for answers, looking for ways to secure their futures. If you think about it, we were talking about risk a little while ago.
Right.
Both on the left and the right, what are we afraid of? We are afraid of somebody else getting the rewards and pushing the risk on us.
True.
And that's what happens when governments start wars or when people have huge unemployment, when a huge job losses and the country has a huge unemployment rate. The rewards are there, as Kelso pointed out, and this is the thing that attracted me to Kelso. We always look at our own. I mean, I keep saying we because we are at the risk-taking end of it.
Right.
We are not, neither you nor I is at the financial reward receiving end of it.
Right.
So those of us who are at the risk-taking end of it, we always see that it's somebody else's decision which is making us take those risks.
Good point.
And I think Kelso realized that, and that's why I wanted to make this film. Not because industrial homesteading may be the answer. For you, that is important. I think for you and for the CESJ, justice and I guess
widespread ownership.
Yeah, I think more like reforming the money system so that the result is the widespread ownership.
Right.
But the means for you, I think, am I right? Is
yes.
Reforming the money system, and therefore by reforming the money system, I think you want to make more capital homesteading possible, right?
Yes, I think as people really look at what's wrong with society, if you analyze it, at the core, you have to follow the money. And when you follow the money, it goes to the central bank, really. And, they have a money creation process where money is being loaned into existence, but for too many different things, and they're monetizing government debt. And there's, compound interest schemes that benefit a very small group of people and make really victims out of a very large group of people. So I think that is one of the main problems in our society, that people don't, it's almost like an invisible problem that people don't understand. So
Exactly. I think this is it. People don't understand it, and so they're afraid of it.
right.
And I started thinking about what the difference is between the traditional systems and these modern money systems. And I realized that the traditional money systems in India are what are seen by, more sophisticated people as corruption.
Good point.
When people in India, and I'm sure when you say good point, you know what I'm talking about because you see it here too.
Right. And I know that there's a long history of governments basically controlling the money. And that has been one of the biggest problems. And that's why they, started the Federal Reserve, was to get the government out of it. But it has become, corrupted and twisted, and where the government is too much involved. But I know that in India, it was basically an arm of the government. It was a government operation, right, for years and years.
Right. And that's something we inherited from the British.
True, exactly.
But parallel to that, why is India so corrupt? And I think one mistake that the Indian government makes all the time, no matter which government is in place, is that they try to uproot corruption without seeing what it is that was put in place by the Indian Constitution. The Indian Constitution could have totally taken out all the governing systems that were in the country for thousands of years. For instance, the community court. I'm trying to kind of translate in my head the words.
Right.
We have something called a community court, or a community decision-making system in each village, in each district. And these districts have been there for centuries, for as long as people have lived there,
Right.
And what the Constitution did was keep these in place as the basis of the new judicial system, or the new electorate. So those districts and those community judicial and administrative systems were kept in place. And if those were kept in place, you have to understand that the economic transactions, the financial transactions that those systems used would remain in place, right?
Right.
And so this whole system of giving a promissory note saying, I'm going to give you X number of rupees, I promise to give you X number of rupees. That's a promissory note that gets handed to somebody. And the only value that has is like a check. It's from one person to another. That can never become a commodity. You can't speculate with those things, right?
Right.
Once you make money a commodity and you don't link it to any assets, people just lose track. It's very hard for people to understand what it is that gives that commodity value, other than demand.
Right. I wonder how those promissory notes compare to the bill of exchange. So the promissory note, it's more or less a loan, and
it's
that's
credit. Yeah,
it's
exactly.
Credit,
Yeah, it's a loan against, right.
But they have the actual rupees that they already exist. They're not creating the rupees with the contract, with the loan.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Because what we propose is for basically a bank to create a contract with a business that has a feasible project that they need money for. And so they would have a more or less a promissory note, what we would call a bill of exchange, where they borrow that money to expand that business, and then the bank can take that contract to the central bank. Basically, the central bank takes on the risk, and then so that creates money out of nothing, which a lot of people would think is a negative thing. But if you think about it, that is a positive thing because it allows for growth, and there's a balance of value on either side of the transaction, and you have new productive growth taking place. So that would be different than what you're talking.
And that's exactly what the Indian government does, because we inherited that system from the British. And exactly right, as you say, without this whole Western concept of credit, we wouldn't have growth.
Okay, yeah.
And we've come to a point where we wonder how good growth is, what kind of growth we need.
Right.
And so we have not only the problem of there being a grassroots exchange of money, which the government never gets to hear about, the parallel economy. And at the other hand, you have government spending, which a lot of people question because, because we don't know. Right now, we don't really have a socialist government. The economy is totally open now. The only difficulty that foreign investors have in India is the bureaucracy, but otherwise it's an open economy. But to come back to Kelso, I really want this film to be as close to Kelso's voice as possible. I'm lucky that he wrote and he did interviews like in the 70s. 1973 was when that first ESOP law was passed as part of the retirement protection law.
Okay.
And in 1973, a lot of companies, that was the boom of the ESOPs. And because companies could get these trusts to borrow money from pre-tax dollars, they didn't pay any taxes. They encouraged these trusts to be formed. Then there was a lot of corruption of those, that ESOP idea too, and which I go into in the film. But Kelso constantly, he actually stopped working with his own company, Kelso and Company, when they started doing a lot of leveraged buyouts in the 90s. He stopped working with them.
Interesting.
And he is very true to his original idea to the end. I really want Kelso to be able to speak in his own voice in the film. And I'm using as much as I can of archival material. In fact, I just found something in the NBC archives where he presents his second income plan to a group in North Carolina that Norm Kurland worked with when they were trying to establish Soul City in North Carolina. You probably know about the Soul City efforts.
Well, actually, I knew about the Old Man River City proposal in St. Louis, East St. Louis.
Okay, right. Norm was involved with that one.
I guess I didn't really know about the one in North Carolina, or I may have read about it and forgot about it.
Right, here's another one. And so, my effort really is to show that these ideas resonate with a wide variety of people in a wide variety of ways. And then just leave the viewer to ask himself, if this many people are looking at it in this many ways, maybe there is something there.
Right.
And maybe even if they don't like the ideas, they can say, hey, if somebody like Louis Kelso can look at a problem in American society and life and look at it differently and speak about it, why can't I?
Right.
So many of us contrarians back off because we don't have support.
That's true.
Here's a guy who never backed off because he really thought through his own ideas. He tested his ideas. So many intellectuals, they don't want to test their ideas. I can't get any academic to say that, okay, I'll try modeling binary economics. Binary economics was something that developed out of Kelso's ideas. The basic idea being that capital produces income as much as labor does. In other words, if you work for wages, then you are limited to what you can make out of your job. And when you lose your job, that's it.
Right.
But as binary
If you
economists,
own some capital,
right,
then you have income no matter what.
right. So that is the second income that Kelso wanted everyone to depend on. And so he called it binary, two
Right.
incomes from two sources.
Right. And
And
the concept that most economists only calculate things in terms of labor and not labor and capital.
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't really say that because
It confuses people sometimes.
and also because this was true of the kinds of theories that were popular in those days, like Keynesian economics and who derived from Marx, that they were really focusing on labor and employment.
Right.
But I've read enough to see that there is the economists were kind of worrying about the marginal, I'm not sure about the terminology, but the income from capital as well. It wasn't all congealed labor as Marx talked about.
Right.
So,
Well, there are still some economists who reject the calculation of, income from capital in their overall macroeconomic models, and they still analyze things on a basis of multiples of labor production. It just doesn't make sense. And I'm sure there are more and more who do consider capital, but
right,
I think
right.
that's why he initially.
That's all I'm saying. That's a little dated. So we have to understand that Kelso was a man of his time. We can't use current economic thinking to criticize Kelso.
That's true.
And this again goes back to what I've been saying, that we're all children of our times and we all have something of value to offer. Just because I'm not a millennial doesn't mean that I can't tell them about something that they might want to hear.
That's true. That's true. Well, I salute your efforts in this project, and I think it is a noble goal to try to have Kelso's voice speak through the work. That's a good thing, and I'm also just encouraged overall and basically in admiration of, the fact that you see the value in these ideas enough to be willing to work on it, and especially someone that's already had success and critical acclaim. So where are you at on the project? I know you've got some communication with PBS probably that you could actually have some airtime there when you get it produced. Or where are you in terms of production, and what can we do to help and move it along?
Well, CSJ has already helped.
Okay, that's good.
CSJ was the first contributor to the Kelso Project Fund. And of course, as you know, I filmed your meeting in 2016. I've interviewed several Kelso associates from the early days. There are two people that I have to interview still. One person was the man who did most of the ESOP trusts in the early days, and the other one is a senator who brought about the Alaska Permanent Fund. What's interesting about the Kelso idea, as I said before, is that he inspired a variety of second income plans, or a variety of plans which could replace all of the ideas that we have of giving everybody a basic income.
Right.
What he was doing was looking at all of the needs people have for income and try to apply his basic idea of capital ownership to them, to see how income could be had from a wide variety of things. And one of those was natural resources, an obvious source, but he devised this plan, which it was called the General Stock Ownership Plan. And once it was passed through Congress, it allowed for the Alaska Permanent Fund to take shape, and it's still in place today. So these are some of the stories that I have to get, and I haven't. And also a lot of archival material. As I said, Kelso did a lot of interviews and wrote a lot. He and his co-author, Patricia Heder, and later his wife,
Right.
They wrote a lot.
And you have interviewed her also.
No. And that's something that I'm hoping I can do, even though she is very unwilling to be on camera.
Oh, okay.
But that's okay. Not everybody, and I don't believe in coercing people. I just believe in persuading people that what I'm doing is valuable, and then they will participate to the degree that they want and can. Kelso's daughters, both his daughters, are very interested in the project. I'm hoping to use them as narrators, actually. So.
Oh, that's good. Speaking of daughters, I have communicated with Russell Long's daughter, and she was very nice at the time. It's been several years, but I could probably find a way to contact her if you'd be interested.
That would be wonderful. See, already you're helping. These are the ways and CESJ can help.
Right. And, speaking of CESJ, I want to mention, you had mentioned the Alaska Permanent Fund, and we had, swapped a few emails on that with Norm. Mm-hmm. There are some projects that are very similar to what CESJ promotes, but since this is a CESJ podcast, I want to say that, CESJ has an idea of the ideal model for using what they would consider to be pure credit, which is basically capital that did not previously exist, and have it loaned into existence with using central bank credit and applied for productive growth. And there are a lot of models that are very similar but not exactly the same. And I think it's okay to look at some of those models and say, hey, here's something very close. It's not ideal, but it is successful. So, what we propose is a little different, and it has pure widespread ownership where perhaps, for example, with the natural resources, you'd have 100% ownership and control by the citizens that live in that area, as opposed to the government owning 50% or however the Alaska Permanent Fund. I just wanted to throw that in, that is a very valid, successful example of widespread ownership, but at the same time, it's not ideal in terms of what CESJ is trying to do. I just wanted to mention that. But it's certainly okay to look at those things as being successful and show why we think other projects like that can be successful, and even more successful if they're 100% widespread owned. So.
Absolutely. One of the reasons I started making this film about Kelso is that he was willing to try anything and everything.
Right.
And even though he had very definite ideas, and some of them were pretty prescient, actually, about what would happen if those ideas were tried, he would look at any possibility. And the Alaska Permanent Fund actually is an independent corporation. The government only decides how much of tax will be deducted.
Oh, okay.
Other than that, it's a totally independent fund. It's independent of the government. It has a very small office in Anchorage.
That's good.
Yeah.
I know that Norm had mentioned something about the actual control of it, and it was some sort of issue for him, but that might be a conversation that we could take up with him sometime. But I know that the 100% ownership and control is something that's important to him, so I always try to mention that. But yeah, there are plenty of examples of success.
Absolutely. And the ESOP organizations now are really looking at the Kelsonian ideas of financing more than ownership, because now they're sponsoring cooperatives, which are one member, one vote, rather than one share, one vote. And cooperatives are using Kelsonian funding ideas,
Okay.
but with complete control because they're cooperative.
Right.
Yeah.
That's good.
So,
Well, speaking of examples of the theories, and actually building, something that people can look at as a successful model, one of my proposals is on that subject, and I think what we should do, if people are not willing to pass capital homesteading legislation nationwide, they could pass it for one Federal Reserve district and use it as a test. And I think that that's something that has not been, promoted as a possibility enough, because I'm confident enough in the ideas that if they could be tested and, shown to be successful, that it would be so successful that the others would follow.
absolutely. And that would be my reason for including the Puerto Rico case in my film. I've been kind of battling with myself about this because the Puerto Rico proposal by the Governor Ferry failed. It didn't get passed.
Right.
And I was wondering whether to include it in the film or not. And from what you say, I think it's important for us to understand that the failure of the Puerto Rico proposal, the proprietary fund proposal to pass, was a result of politics and had nothing to do with its whether it was good or not. Because Governor Ferry, who proposed it, was out of office in the following election. One year it was passed by the lower house in Puerto Rico. I'm not sure what it's called.
Right.
And then it was sent up to their version of the Senate. And that's when they got Samuelson, the economist, to do a critique of it, and he kind of turned it down without even looking at the details. There's a whole exchange between Kelso and Samuelson on paper. They never met about this. And then that very year, while it was still being debated in Senate, Governor Ferry lost, his party lost control of the Senate. And that was the end of that.
Wow.
So,
now, what was the actual name of that proposal?
The Proprietary Fund for the Progress of Puerto Rico.
Okay.
PPP.
I'm going to have to read up.
Something like that.
I'm going to have to read up on that.
Right.
Interesting.
I talked to John Novak, who was the lawyer in Puerto Rico who actually met Kelso on a flight and engineered this whole thing. And he gave me all the details. In his book, his autobiography, Something to Do with Wings, I think it's called, he talks about this. But there's enough evidence, everything's on record about what transpired and how much Samuelson actually read and how much he didn't read.
People put too much faith and emphasis on someone like Samuelson, and that comes back to what I was saying about have a test. Let's let someone like Samuelson, I don't know who would be the prevailing economist now, but let that person propose a system in one particular Fed district, and then have capital homesteading in another, and then maybe have a basic income in another, actually make each Fed district a test area.
Yeah, in fact, I think Norm is doing that. Isn't he working with the Chicago Feds? Is it the Chicago? I know that they are planning the homesteading program for Lincoln Park, which is outside of Detroit.
Yeah, they're actually trying to get some community involvement there. They haven't really made significant progress on actually passing a local law yet, I don't think.
There's a meeting on the 28th of April, and I'm hoping something will come out of that.
Yeah,
Because,
that would be great.
here's another way in which people can help. If you know of any efforts going on where, on the ground, I believe that the film needs not only theory, and especially because Kelso is at the center of the film, we need to see this kind of project taking shape.
Right.
So I would love to be able to film something which is and not just people talking about it, but people actually doing it.
Right.
One problem I've had, Dave, and I should probably mention this here, is that so many companies that I've approached, when they hear about the project, they are gung-ho, they're very happy, and they want to participate. But then when I actually want to set a date, they get cold feet.
Right. Yeah.
And I think it has to do with the legal ramifications.
Yeah, and things are, owned by big shareholders right now in a lot of cases, and they want to keep the status quo. So a manager might like an idea, but then when it comes to presenting it to the shareholders, it's not so popular. So that's always a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Well, is there any other subjects that you want to talk about before we sign off?
I think I've covered pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. The film is currently called, this is going to be my year of fundraising, and I'm going to apply for grants just to make sure that I have the right project. Getting a grant means that I have an audience, and it's resonating with people outside of the Kelso community. And so that's why I want to spend some time applying for grants. Once I have the grant and I have some feedback which tells me exactly where I want to go, or where I'm going is right and it's got an audience, that's when I'm going to start, showing things to people and moving forward. At this point, the title is Everyone an Owner, the Vision of Louis Kelso. Someone suggested take Louis Kelso's name out because he's not that recognized, and said call it Everyone an Owner, a Radical Capitalist Vision.
Well,
I don't
think
know.
You're right to focus on Kelso in the title because he started it,
Yeah. He was called a radical capitalist in a negative kind of way, when he was, It's really funny, there's one guy in San Francisco. It was a left-wing paper. I forget the name of the paper right now, which said, Louis, get rid of those wingtips and come grow your hair and come join us. This is where you belong.
That's funny. Yeah, that would have changed his image considerably.
I know. And that to me is a challenge because, like me, like all of us contrarians, he falls between the two positions. It's very easy if you are in one camp or the other to get yourself heard.
Right, that's true. And that's interesting that you keep using, the label contrarian, and it's good because not only do you fall between the left and right, but you also fall between, conventional and radical, but everything should be questioned. I think that, evidence of success is always the most important test, and it doesn't, have to be pure in terms of, someone's philosophy. It's what works is what's important, and I think that's the contrarian message.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And before we close, I would like to mention your 2013 speech at the Lincoln Memorial.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
It's online if anybody wants to listen to it. I'm sure everybody listening to this podcast will know it, but if you don't, please go and look at Dave Hamill's 2013. I think it's on Norm Kurland's channel.
Well, I appreciate that. I actually had two speeches. Norm likes the one that I gave at the Federal Reserve better, where I focused on customers with money.
I know, that was the punchline of that one. but I really like that. Was it earlier, 2013,
No, it was.
the Lincoln Memorial?
I think
Was
it
later.
was 13 at the memorial. That was the second one, and the title of that one was "Capital Homesteading for Evangelical Christians."
Yes, yes. I think that's why I like it, because my father-in-law was a Southern Baptist, and there's a
Okay.
whole story someday I have to tell you about that.
Oh, I'd like to hear it. But I was going to say that, there's a significant number of Catholics now who consider themselves in the evangelical category. It's,
Absolutely, especially in
yeah,
South and Central America.
that's true.
Yeah,
That's true. Right. Well, I appreciate you giving that
yeah.
plug. Is there maybe a website or anything that you would like to mention where people could follow you or support you in any way?
If you want to know more about me, I'm on LinkedIn under the
Okay.
name Hart Films.
Okay.
So if you go to LinkedIn, and that's the one that I update most regularly. I will build a website for the Kelso project, but I will do that when I've gotten my first grant and I know where I'm going with it.
So, if things go as expected, do you expect to actually have the film done within the next year, 2 years, 3 years? What are you looking at?
We're looking at a 2021 broadcast date. I know that that'll freak people out because everybody thinks it's going to be done next year. But I've found that if you take your time, for instance, the first film that I made in 1998, it took me a long time in this country. I used to make films in India, but here, I started that film in 1993, I think. Finished
Okay.
in 1998. It's still in distribution. It's still making money.
Wow.
Many of
What
the
was the name of that
people,
one?
Roots in the Sand. It was
Roots in the
about the
Sun.
first people that came from India to the United States.
Okay.
Yeah, and most people don't realize that we had people here in agriculture, pretty much like the Mexicans, from 1890s,
Wow.
and they were laborers in the California fields and eventually became owners.
What's the best way for someone to watch that documentary?
Ask your PBS station to air it
Okay. Okay.
because
So you
it's
don't think
not.
it's on YouTube?
No, the PBS, they wouldn't even let anybody, even the distributors are an arm of PBS. They are the Asian American arm of the PBS, and they're headquartered in San Francisco. And they sell so many to educational institutions that they won't let PBS download it for
Wow.
viewing. So
Interesting.
I know.
Well, hey, at least you're still, you said, making a little income off of it, so that's a
Yeah,
good thing.
yeah.
But we
And
won't
that's what I'm
complain
saying.
about not
You
being
know,
able to see it on YouTube.
yeah, and if anybody really wants to see it, just email me, and I'll figure out a way. Recently, somebody wanted it, and, I had an old VHS, and they had a way of playing VHS, so I just gave it to them.
So
So,
my wife is an educator, so you think she would be able to request for her students to see it from PBS?
absolutely. Or if you want to email me, is she teaching in school or
Yeah,
college?
just high school, yeah.
High school. Okay. The local library, that would be another place to look.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a
Because
great idea.
a lot of libraries bought them, and the library, or if you kind of send me an email or ask her to send me an email, and I'll forward it to the distributor.
Okay,
And
that
then
sounds
maybe
good.
they can get the school district to pay for it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So if anyone is listening and they find interest in that, there's a way that you can get an educational institution to
Yeah.
participate.
Sisters
So
of
that's good.
Selma is available for another 5 years on DVD, home video.
Okay, I think I
But
watched it on YouTube.
no, I don't
No, I
think
didn't.
so. No.
Okay.
Yeah, because they're pretty good about controlling. You may have seen the trailers. I put a bunch of trailers on. I brought some DVDs to the meeting, so
Maybe that's where I saw
Yeah.
it. I'm watching. You're right. You're right.
You
Okay,
may
so
have
that's.
picked up one of those because I wanted everybody at CSJ to,
I
I
know
mean,
I saw.
CSJ was my first funder, so I wanted everyone to have a copy.
Right. Yeah,
So
I know I saw
yeah,
the whole thing.
yeah.
So.
So I'm sure you saw a DVD.
Right.
And
Okay.
so with that one, what happened was that the university, Catholic university in Kansas City, Avila University, they archived the project. And in
Good.
exchange for getting the rights to the entire project, they paid for licensing all the footage. And
Wow.
that came to $40,000.
Wow.
So this is the kind of money you're looking at for the Kelso project if it's going to have that much archival stuff. I
Right.
doubt that it will have that much archival stuff, but there is 60 Minutes with Mike Wallace. There's, I'm not sure how much of that I'll use, but definitely the Bill Moyers interview with Kelso, which he did for the PBS NewsHour. That is very good, and I'm going to use quite a bit of that. And then if the NBC footage turns out to be very good and useful, then I'll need licensing fees for that. So there's going to be plenty of opportunity. And, all the ESOP organizations, they've given me lists of companies which would be willing to match any grants that I get. So.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
That is great. It sounds like you're moving right along in terms of, feasibility and getting things done.
Right. So I'm mentioning these things so that people see that you have to take time in the early stages. Once things are in place, things happen fast. Even with Sisters of Selma, I got the PBS station in 2003. ITVS, which is the major licensor from PBS, in 2005 or 2006, and 2007 it was released.
Okay.
So once everything falls into place, it's very easy, quick.
Right. Well, that's
but you
good.
have
You
to be
certainly
careful.
laid the groundwork.
Yeah, you have to. Yeah, exactly. Laying the groundwork. That's what takes time.
Right. Well, it's great that you've done that. You've obviously been working on it for years, so, and that's what it takes, and you've done it before, so hats off to you. And you already have won some awards, right? Mostly for Sisters of Selma?
Yeah, for Roots in the Sand as well. In fact, Roots in the Sand won more awards than Sisters of Selma.
Wow.
The one that I'm really proud of for Sisters of Selma is the Emmy nomination. We didn't win, but we got nominated.
You were nominated for an Emmy.
Yeah. It was nominated in the directing, writing, and music categories.
Interesting.
And somebody today asked me for our version of Amazing Grace. We had a instrumental arrangement of Amazing Grace in the film.
Oh, good.
And so totally out of the blue, I got an email saying, "Where can I get that soundtrack?" It's nice.
Well, congratulations on all your awards. They're obviously deserved. And thank you for spending some valuable time with me today on this podcast. And
well, thank you for having me, Dave. And yes, and I hope this is useful for your listeners. And I hope everybody gets enthused about whatever it is that they are working on, believing in, and go out there and get energized.
That's good. And you're right. It's not just the widespread ownership, but the way that you've worked on what you're passionate about. And that is inspirational to anyone who has something they're working on. So that's a beautiful thing. And, well, thanks again. And you have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon.
You have a good one, too. Thank you, Dave.
Okay. Thanks again.